Hey folks, welcome back to our recorded lectures for ML103. This is Exploring the World Tree, depicting Scandinavian cosmology. So our questions for today. What are the basic elements of Scandinavian cosmology? How was their universe shaped? How did these medieval ideas influence our case study games? And today we're going to be focusing on God of War and Assassin's Creed Valhalla. Before we get to answering those questions, however, I thought I might say a few words about our sources for these medieval ideas, because they are not straightforward and they do not present as clear a view of the Viking view of the universe as the popular imagination would have you believe. So if you have seen the first Thor movie from Marvel, you might remember a scene where Thor and Jane are sitting together under the stars and he sketches out a diagram of the 9 realms for her. You cannot do that based on our medieval Scandinavian sources. 9 worlds are mentioned more than once, but they're not clearly specified. The tradition shifts from source to source. Sometimes it's even contradictory. And this sort of thing is pretty much inevitable. Remember, these beliefs existed long before the Scandinavians were a written culture. The process of writing them down is a process of interpretation, especially given that nearly all of our documentary sources are produced in the Christian period, so we can't know how the original ideas were changed in the process. So regarding Scandinavian cosmology in general, there have been scholars who've hypothesized that originally it took the shape that it did because it had something to do with the collision between Indo-European pastoralists and native agriculturalists. It's hard to say anything specific, though, because what do we have to base it on? Primarily a 13th century compendium of myths by Snorri Sturluson and other post-conversion adaptations like Saxo Grammaticus. I'll tell you about both of them in a bit. Now, there are pre-Christian sources, but there aren't that many of them, and they're tricky to deal with. You have the picture stones from Gotland. Some of them can be related to later mythology, some can't. There are some fragments of skaldic verse from the pre-Christian period that give us glimpses of the gods. Certainly the Poetic Edda does, but although at least some of them come from the pre-Christian period, they came out of the oral tradition into the written tradition, and they are written down by Christians at some point. So when you take oral literature and you turn it into written literature, it's like freezing a version of it in place, whereas oral literature shifts depending on who's performing it. So it will always be changed by that process of writing it down. Now, Saxo Grammaticus, as a university-trained writer, would have deliberately altered what he wrote about. Snorri did want to pass on the tales in an authentic way, but that doesn't mean he passed them on in the way he received them either. Now, some of the poems that appear to be older might have been composed post-conversion by antiquarians, or they could have been changed in the transmission process and only looked like they were produced by Christians. It's impossible to tell. So you always have to wonder, how much are they really saying about pre-Christian belief? Now, the Poetic Edda is preserved in a text called the Codex Regius. It's a manuscript that dates till 1280, and that's it in the image there. It's a copy of an earlier manuscript that's long since been lost, and that manuscript may have been a copy of an earlier manuscript. We're not sure. The Codex Regius is the only source for most of the poems it contains, and it is an Icelandic national treasure. It had been kept in Denmark after being given as a gift to the King of Denmark in the 17th century, and in the 1970s they decided they would send it back to Iceland. But because it is so important, the Danes sent a whole naval flotilla along with it as accompaniment. Now, the Poetic Edda are certainly the oldest sources we have. There are poems that range from mythological to heroic. Probably the best known is the Voluspa, the Prophecy of the Cirrus. This summarizes the mythology from the origins of the cosmos to its destruction. And you are going to be reading some of this poem for tutorial. Now, it constantly amazes me how much medieval culture we only have by chance. So another example would be the poem Beowulf. We have one manuscript of it. One manuscript survived, and that manuscript was nearly lost in a famous fire at one of the libraries in England. So how many other poems like Beowulf were out there originally? How many other compendiums of Norse mythology were out there that just have not survived over the centuries? It's a bit depressing to think about that, honestly. Now, we also have, as I mentioned, skaldic poetry. Skalds are court poets. Their poetry is often very formal and ornate. Sometimes it takes the form of shield poems that describe shields that are given as gifts at court. They're usually decorated with scenes from heroic legend or mythology. We have pieces of these poems preserved because early Christian writers put a high value on poems about kings and rulers and continued to transmit them. But they are not transmitted intact, and we have to remember that. So about Snorri. It's a great name, Snorri Sturluson. I love that name. So he is an Icelandic writer, and he's a really great example of how this material is sort of spun into a new form by later writers. It was born towards the end of the 12th century. It's connected to powerful people within Iceland. He was actually law speaker twice, so he held a very powerful position. He was assassinated in 1241, probably on the orders of the King of Norway. But he is our best-known Icelandic writer. He was a poet who used narrative frames to retell myths, legends, and guide younger would-be poets. But he always emphasized to them, you're not to believe in the literal truth of any of this. So he explored the myths, but he saw them as stories. Now, he speculated a lot about the origins of some of these figures, and I'll explain Troy in a minute. We know he was very familiar with Eddic poetry and skaldic poetry because he uses stuff directly from both. But the Troy thing. So, if there is a universal truth about medieval European cultures, is that for some reason, everybody wanted to be related to the losers of the Trojan War. You know, it's dating back to the Aeneid or something, I don't know. So what he does is he tries to create a connection between the Trojans and the Scandinavian gods. So Tror, or Thor, is the grandson of Priam, and he travels the world. He settles down with Sif, whose name is also Sybil. And then 18 generations later is born Woden, or Odin. Now, remember, he's writing in the 13th century, and at that point, Icelanders would know the story of Troy. They would know about Agamemnon and Priam. And Snorri emphasizes that the myths are actually based on these historic figures, he claims. So this is an example of what we call euhemerism. And this is after a Greek scholar, Euhemeros, or other philosopher, who claimed that Zeus was a mortal king who was elevated by legend into a deity. Now, Odin, Snorri says, was a prophet who moved to the north and set his sons up as kings there. And that is a way, perhaps, of trying to make Scandinavia less peripheral to the rest of the world. So you have Odin as chieftain, you have the Aesir and the Vanir War depicted as a historical conflict. And I think you can see just from that quick description just how problematic he is as a source for pre-Christian mythology. The problem, of course, is that we don't have any other options. It's him and the Eddas. There's not a lot beyond that. So if we were going to piece together the basics, what would we do? So Scandinavian mythology is a narrative with a strong cosmological orientation. It talks about how the world was made and how it is destroyed. There are two groups of beings who fight over the world, and this is what drives that cycle. The gods, the Aesir, and the giants, the Jotun. Both groups are depicted as tribal or kin groups. Sometimes they're depicted as the forces of order and the forces of chaos. The world they operate in is recognizable as Scandinavia, although it has its own place names, its own climate, its own geography. Now here's something interesting. The world is created by the Aesir out of the body of Ymir. And Ymir is a primordial being who is the progenitor of the giant race. And when I say the progenitor of the giant race, basically they emerge from his body while he's sleeping. So he's he can pull off this sort of hermaphroditic conception. That's probably an attempt to emphasize that the giants are alien beings. Now, from the same mythic time period, we have the proto-cow, Othumla. Now, like Ymir, Othumla is formed out of drops of moisture. It's kind of hard to explain the process that Snorri elaborates on. It's sort of like the conflict between hot and cold, what happens when the primordial ice begins to melt. So Othumla, like any cow, produces milk, and her milk sustains Ymir. But because she is a cow, she also licks a block of salt, and by doing so, she creates the first Aesir, who is Buri. Buri sires a son, presumably on a giantess, Bor, and his sons were Odin, Vili, and Ve. Now, according to Snorri, the three boys are the ones who create the world, and they create the world by killing Ymir. The blood that comes from his wounds kill all the frost giants except one family who gets away, kind of like a take on the Christian story of Noah and the flood. And Odin and his brothers dismember Ymir. They make the earth from his flesh, the sea and the lakes from his blood, mountains from his bones, rocks from his teeth, heaven from his skull, etc. Now, it's not actually uncommon in world mythology for the death of a monster to be somehow involved in the creation of the world. But still, there's something very vivid and kind of visceral about this idea of Ymir to me. Now, what about Yggdrasil? If the world is made from pieces of Ymir's body, where does the world tree come from? So it is mentioned in the Poetic Edda. The most detailed depiction of it is from Odin's perspective, and he talks about how the different races live under different roots of the great ash tree. And there are also creatures who live within the tree. Ratatosk, who is a sort of a divine squirrel, Nidhogg, who is the serpent who gnaws on the roots, and several other serpents and assorted beings. Snorri expands on the description of Yggdrasil. He basically puts it in the mythological plane. And there's an interesting connection here. The Havamal, which is wisdom poetry from the Codex Regius, also discusses Odin hanging himself on a tree to gain wisdom, and it's possible that this is meant to be the world tree. Now, the Christian scholar Adam of Bremen, who writes in the mid to late 11th century, talks about a temple at Uppsala where there's a yew tree that stands in front of the temple and they hang sacrificial victims from it. So this could be a sort of repeating motif in pre-Christian Scandinavian belief. It seems very likely. The idea of a world tree is actually quite common again in Eurasian mythology, especially in shamanic contexts, where the tree is the path into the world of the spirits. So now that I've given you the basics, I want to talk about how these two of our case study games make use of this material. We're not going to talk about Skyrim. They do certainly use Norse myth in Skyrim, but it's got less of a focus on cosmology, with the exception of having a Valhalla equivalent. But God of War and Assassin's Creed Valhalla make use of this material extensively. So let's talk about God of War first. So I want to read you just a quote, and it is a quote from Freya, who is trying to explain what Yggdrasil is to Kratos and Atreus. And she says, "The tree of life is bound to the fate of the world, just as we are bound to it. The tree nourishes our soils. The dew from its leaves feeds our valleys and rivers. The tree's very existence supports all of creation amongst its boughs, its life energy interwoven into the tapestry of life. Birth, growth, death, and rebirth. Every strand transcending time, transcending space. Everything comes back to the tree." So this is how the tree is framed within the world of God of War. It's a very literal thing, but it's also a transcendent thing. It's a narrative element, but it is also part of the mechanics of the game on many different levels. So the 9 realms are located amongst its branches, just like in the original mythology, but the tree itself exists in what the game calls the realm between the realms. So it's like Snorri's concept of mythological space. Kratos and his son figure out how to use it to travel between different realms. They can enter gateways and walk along the world tree's branches. It's a dangerous sort of travel. You can very easily get lost or misplaced. Now, when they used the travel room, the Bifrost in Tyr's temple, they actually see a representation of the world tree and its roots. And that's what you have in the image there on that slide. Now, you discover while you're progressing through the game that Tyr helped the giants by hiding the travel tower for Jotunheim amongst the tree's roots, basically as a way of trying to protect them from the Aesir. You are also told that as part of Ragnarok, there will be a battle between Jormungandr, the world serpent, and Thor, and supposedly it will shake the tree so violently that it will break, and it will send the world serpent back to a time before its birth. So this is actually what explains why, when Kratos and Atreus meet Jormungandr, that the serpent basically is under the impression that he's met Atreus before. Now, there are 2 additional game mechanics involved with the tree. So first of all, you have Yggdrasil's dew. And you can collect different types of dew in order to increase various stats for Kratos. Each piece of dew will increase a different stat. The crystallized sap, on the other hand, is more of a functional element. Basically, it conducts electricity, which can produce explosions if, say, you hit it with Atreus' shock arrows. So it's a way of helping to figure out how to move forward. There are puzzles where making your way through the sap is part of it. If you hit it with a shock arrow, it will cause the branches to wither away and create an opening. It's a common element after a certain point in the game. So what we see here is a very thorough integration of this medieval element, Yggdrasil, into the game. Not just into the lore, but also into the gameplay mechanics itself. And arguably, something like Yggdrasil really lends itself to this type of integration, because in its mythical form, it's bound into the structure of the world. So why not use it to structure the game world as well? It's a very natural extension of the idea, because it marks boundaries and it lays out a perfect way to travel between different regions. Now, things like the dew and the sap are extensions of the myth, but again, logical in their way. If it's a magical cosmic tree, its tree-like features are also probably magical. And aesthetically speaking, it's also remarkably resonant. I mean, we have certain cultural associations that it evokes. The symbolism of the world tree just feels pre-modern to us. And it is such a common element in so many different cultural traditions that it's recognizable. All right, moving on now to Assassin's Creed Valhalla to close things out. Now, something that we will talk in much greater detail over the course of several lectures is Valhalla's use of Norse myth as a way of framing its Isu storyline. So the myths are the way in which the medieval character of Eivor understands what they discover about the history of this precursor civilization. Eivor doesn't recognize the Isu as a different non-human civilization. Eivor interprets them as their gods. There's a whole set of quests within Valhalla where Eivor explores Asgard and Jotunheim in a vision quest. And it is a very traditional depiction. Asgard and Jotunheim are depicted very much like you would expect to see in just this straight-out mythology. But it is actually an interpretive lens, because someone like Eivor is not able to see the Isu for what they are. They have to find a culturally appropriate way to interpret the information they're receiving. So what's interesting is that Yggdrasil shows up in a couple of different forms. So in the visions of Asgard and Jotunheim, it's an actual tree. And it's what you would expect it to be. It's a gigantic freaking tree that basically takes over the whole horizon. It's the world tree in its most traditional sense. But in the real world, it also shows up as the Isu supercomputer, which is built as a way to store Isu consciousness and then reincarnate them into human bodies. This is something that the Isu did as a way to escape the so-called Great Catastrophe, which was a solar flare, coronal mass ejection. And Eivor and his brother Sigurd, I'm struggling to decide whether or not I should talk about Eivor as female or male, because it's interchangeable. Technically, I think the female Eivor is supposed to be the canon character. Eivor and Sigurd encounter the supercomputer in a vault under Norway, in one of the final arcs of the game. It is, suffice to say, rather creepy. And that's it in the image there. It restrains the body, basically hangs it on the tree, while it penetrates the skull and sends the mind into a simulation. And specifically for Sigurd and Eivor, it's a simulation of Valhalla. There are definite parallels here to Odin hanging on the tree to gain wisdom, which we'll talk about at the next lecture. Now, Ymir is mentioned at the very outset of the game, with the seer's narration just before the opening cinematic. And it's very clearly based on various poems, bits and pieces of poems from the Poetic Edda. It works as a very grim sort of framing of the world as a violent place born of Ymir's death. So I'm just going to read you a couple of quotes. So from the Voluspa, you've got this bit. There was in times of old where Ymir dwelt, nor sand, nor sea, nor gelid waves. Earth existed not, nor heaven above. 'Twas a chaotic chasm, and grass nowhere. This is the seeress's narration from the beginning of Valhalla. Silence, you children of gods, and heed my tale of time's beginning. All was dark, there was no sand, there was no sea, no earth nor sky, nor grass nor wind, till fire met ice in the gasping void. And from this scream came the giant Ymir, first of all beings. Proud Ymir, cruelly killed, yet from whose bones and blood and brains the world was made, the world you walk and war upon. That last bit is taken more from Snorri Sturluson, but it's a very clear and direct adaptation of Norse poetry. And it really does give you this creepy feeling at the beginning of the game because you hear it and then you move into this scene where everything goes terribly for Eivor's family. Like, it's very grim. And we'll watch that clip, by the way, at our Zoom session. Now, like in God of War, there are a couple of additional mechanics. Eivor has the ability within the Vision Quest arcs to collect Ymir's tears and Ymir's blood. If you get the full set of each and present them at the right altar, you get 5 skill points apiece. And they are tricky, especially the bloodstones, which are found in Jotunheim. You need to solve various puzzles and find your way through difficult terrain and past obstacles. They are not, however, necessary. You don't have to do them. And they're definitely not as well integrated into the game as the Dew and the Sap in God of War. They're kind of fetch quests, probably, is the best way to put it. And that's one of the faults in the Assassin's Creed reboots, and there's still a lot of it, even in Valhalla, which has been slimmed down considerably. That being said, the Asgard and Jotunheim of the Vision Quest are very vividly realized, and as we'll see when we get to Ragnarok, there are connections to that myth as well. Yggdrasil is implicated in the rebirth of the world, according to various interpretations. So I'm hoping that gives you a sense of how 2 of our case study games incorporate elements of Scandinavian cosmology. You might wonder who I think does it better. And I think I've got to say that functionally speaking, as an integrated part of the game, I've got to say God of War. I like what Valhalla does with the Norse myth as a sort of cultural interpretive screen, but that's more limited to the narrative and the lore side of the game, whereas with God of War, it's actually a key part of the mechanics as well. Now, when it comes to Ragnarok, my answer is going to be slightly different, but that is something that we will get to at a later date. For now, I'm going to wrap this one up and get started on our next lecture on Odin. So talk to you guys later.